Hi, everybody. Kate Haley here with Glazer's Camera in Seattle, Washington. I hope you are all having a great week so far. We are super excited to present this session with Sigma today. Before we get into that, I would love to just take a little bit of time to tell you about Glazer's Camera. I know many of you are tuning in literally from around the world, and we find that so amazing. So it's so wonderful to have you here. Glazer's is a camera store independently owned since 1935. It's a family-operated business. The current owners are the grandchildren of the founder. So we've been in business for 86 years, which is crazy town, but also awesome. So along with these online events, we also do in-person events, and obviously we sell camera gear too. So if you're in the US, ideally, you can order gear. We can ship to other places, of course, but my guess is it might be better for you to get things locally. However, get started on this. So today we are here to talk about advanced macro photography, and we have Brett Wells with us from Sigma. Now, perhaps earlier in the year, you were able to view the kind of starting macro photography session we did, I think, a few months ago. And so this will kind of pick up where that left off with some more advanced techniques and approaches. Sorry, I've only had one cup of coffee today, so I'm working on saying words like techniques, so here we go. I also want to introduce Aaron. Aaron works with Sigma as well, and Aaron is our regional rep. So if you've been to our store in Seattle or maybe attended other Sigma events online, you've probably seen Aaron before. And he's going to be online to help with questions that you have coming in. And let's talk about that for a second. How do you ask questions? So throughout the presentation, we'll do some Q&A, and then we'll probably wrap up with a few closing questions. So if you have questions about the topic or Sigma lenses, please feel free to get those posted in the comments on Facebook or in the chat on YouTube. Like I said, myself and Aaron will both be in the YouTube chat and the Facebook monitoring that. We'll answer some of your questions right there in the chat, and we'll do some live Q&A as well with Brett. So with all that said, I would love to kick this over to Brett so we can dive into his presentation.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Glazers, for putting this all together. Thank you, Sigma, for making this happen today as well. You all are in great hands with Aaron moderating chat. He's a very proficient photographer on his own, and he'll be able to answer a lot of those questions, but I promise we will make time. If there's something that they think needs to be answered during the presentation, they'll let me know, and I'll try to answer those questions as we go along. But definitely we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So I won't let anybody get stranded where you can't get your questions answered. And in case I forget to mention this toward the end, if you want to find me online, the best way to do that is Brett Wells Photo on Instagram. It's 2 T's, BRETTWELLS. You can find me there, follow me there, ask me questions there, any of that kind of thing. But certainly, like I said, there'll be plenty of time today to do that as well. I'll give you a little bit of background about me. If you've ever seen me before, you've heard all this, so I'm not going to tell you too much. But I got into photography seriously about 25 years ago. I went and got a master's degree, came back to the States and taught photography here in Atlanta for about 7.5 years. And then I got into the sales and marketing side, and I've been with Sigma almost that whole time, about 12 or 13 years now. I've been a tech rep for the company for the Southeast for most of that time, and I've been the education coordinator for the company for the last couple of years as well. So that being said, let's jump into advanced macro. And there is a lot of information that we're going to cover today. Like I said, so make sure that you ask your questions or write them down, whatever it is. Hopefully, I'll try to predict some of them and answer them ahead of time, but want to make sure that you get your questions answered today as well. I always like to start presentations with the basics, and just to make sure we're all on the same page. For most of what we're going to do in advanced macro photography, most of this type of work is going to be, it's going to be inside quite often, could be outside. Almost inevitably, we're dealing with longer exposures, longer shutter speeds. So we're going to be using tripods and cable releases and things like that. Frank. Sorry, folks. Got company. So we need to have a really good solid tripod. I don't recommend the little small travel things. For what we're going to be doing, we're going to be setting up a lot more equipment, bigger equipment, where you're going to be needing to something that can really stabilize the equipment that you're using, something that can help to dampen out all those vibrations. So a really good solid tripod. If you are anywhere close to Glazer's, go in and talk to the folks there. I know they can help you find something that's really appropriate for that. And I'll show you some examples of the setups that I've done through as we go through some of these different techniques as well. So you'll be able to see those kind of things as we go. Tabletop tripods, I've got a little one here. I use those a lot more for lights than I do for cameras. There's a bunch of different companies that make them, but anything like that is kind of a nice way of setting things up. Camera stands, if you happen to have one, they're not so popular anymore, but they actually work really well for this kind of subject matter and techniques and that kind of thing. So if you've ever been in a portrait studio or something, you might have a camera stand sitting around, or you might find one in the classifieds or something like that. You want some way to trigger the camera remotely. After all that we do to set this up and get the exposures right and the focus right and the depth of field right, the last thing you want to do is shake the camera by pushing down the button on the camera. And it will. We'll talk about a number of times. You're not just magnifying the subject, you're magnifying everything. And that's the movement of the subject, the movement of the camera, everything else. So you want to be able to trigger the camera remotely. I use just a simple cable release, plugs into the side of the camera. It doesn't have a battery, so I know it's always going to be there and always working. It's a personal preference kind of thing, though. Some people like wireless ones. Some people use the apps on their phone. There are a number of different products. There are things like Cam Rangers and stuff like that that you can trigger cameras remotely as well. And any way that you can do that is fine. For a lot of what we're doing, if the subject's not moving much or not moving, you'd be able to use the timer on the camera. That may be a way to work as well. The next is going to be nodal rails, nodal slides, and other things like that. The ability to slide a camera forward or backward in the tripod head itself can be very advantageous for a lot of these techniques for a lot of different reasons. Some of it just to get the composition or the magnification down. Some of it comes down to focusing. It's just anything we can do to make the positioning of the camera easier is going to be a good thing. So nodal rails are something that are used in panoramics, but basically the same thing. You'd also call a macro rail or a macro slide. Kind of just looks like a long lens plate. You might screw that into the bottom of the camera. Some of them have clamps on the end that would clamp on a quick release plate or an L bracket that would be on your camera. And I've got a few images, maybe not the most detailed, but hopefully you'll have some idea and you'll be able to look those kind of things up if you don't. You move from that to more dedicated macro rails that might slide in multiple directions, or geared rails, again, that are going to have geared controls for moving forward or backward, left or right. Not always, not usually up and down. Sometimes the tripods do that, but I'm not a big fan of geared center columns. They don't really position the cameras that accurately. Lights, we're going to be losing a lot of exposure. Macro, you lose exposure to begin with. We'll have a whole slide talking about that. But as we get to greater than 1-to-1 reproduction, you're going to lose even more light. You're going to lose more exposure. So natural light or your normal interior lights, overhead or a lamp or something like that, may not be the most appropriate, may not be the most beneficial to use. One, they may not be in the right direction, but two, they're probably not going to be bright enough to give you reasonable exposure times. So anything that you can use, I have a couple of these little LED panels. This is from a company called Photix, but they don't make this one anymore, so I don't even really like to talk about that one in particular, just the one that I have. But Godox, I know, ProMaster, I can't even think, Loom, I think, makes some. Anyway, there's a bunch of different companies that make something similar to this. It's just a simple LED panel that has a battery built into it. They're nice and thin. You can carry them on location, but they work nicely for this kind of thing. They usually have a little 1/4-20 socket in them, so they'll work on these tabletop tripods just fine, even on bigger light stands and tripods and things if you need them to. You can use light boxes. If you have an old light box that you used to use for looking at slides or negatives, believe it or not, that's a decent amount of light. If it's fluorescent, it's probably not close to daylight, but hopefully we can balance light with the camera. If it's an LED version of it, then it'd be pretty useful already for daylight balance, that type of thing. But you could use it as a light source for the side of a subject. You can use it to illuminate like underneath the subject. You can use it as a background. There's a lot of different things you could do with big light boxes or light panels like that. And then it's always helpful to have a reflector around, and I'm looking for mine. I use just a little one. It opens up to maybe 18 inches or something like that. For macro work, that's really all you need, whether I'm shooting out in the field for just shooting flowers or shooting here inside or whatever the case may be, just to be able to bounce a little light back in, use it as a white or black background in a pinch, anything like that. It's just a nice thing to keep around. You'll find that anything that you can use to help prop things up, hold things down, keep things from moving, all sorts of different clamps. I use just regular pony clamps from the hardware store for a lot of things. The background behind me is clamped onto the background stand with those. You can pinch a subject and prop it up somehow. You can hold backgrounds on the backs of bar stools, just all sorts of things you can do with simple little clamps. They get more adventurous. There are all sorts of like flexible arms. There's a product from Wimberley called a Plamp, P-L-A-M-P, short for plant clamp. And the second version of that is actually pretty useful for holding up backgrounds as well as subject matter and those kinds of things. Even extra tripods. I'm looking around, like you can see all this stuff behind me here, but I have a tripod over there. I have two little tripods with lights on them here. And I use those kind of things for lighting things on my tabletop. I just grab one of the little LEDs and bring it over here on a tripod. So tripods and light stands and all those kind of things come in handy. Even if it's not a very sturdy tripod for your camera, might be fine for putting up a small light. And then think about surfaces, backgrounds, whatever else is going to be in the shot other than the subject itself. So I'm trying to look at tabletops, counters, fabrics that might go on the background, might sweep up as a background, or that I can prop up behind a subject, whether it's immediately behind the subject or a distance away, whatever it is. And I'm going to look around as I go outside. I might find a big piece of tree bark that would be a great surface to put something on to do a shot, or a big leaf or whatever it is. Sometimes I'm looking for subject matter. Sometimes I'm looking for the other things that are going to compose a picture as well. Some basic techniques that are going to apply to just about everything we talk about here. And then another slide or two, and we'll actually get into looking at techniques kind of one by one. The first of those is I'm always thinking about aperture first. I'll back up a second and say everything that I'm going to do, everything that I'm going to show you was done in manual. A lot of these techniques will not work in autofocus, auto exposure, auto anything. A lot of times the camera doesn't even have communication with the lens anymore. And we'll talk about those when we go through some of these techniques. But the aperture control, I don't want the camera to change anything. I want it set the way I want it set, mostly for depth of field. But as far as focusing goes, I'm going to open the aperture up to its widest first in order to focus. And there's two reasons for that. One, the smallest number that your lens can achieve, can open up to, is going to give you the most amount of light. So there's more light coming through. It's easier to see, especially if it's a DSLR, but it's even better for live view on mirrorless cameras. I know some of the cameras today, you can set live view up at 50,000 ISO and it still looks beautiful, but most of us don't have cameras that do that kind of thing. The other is it's going to give you the shallowest depth of field possible for that lens. And that may sound counterintuitive, but it's easier to focus when it's an obvious sharp part of the image and obvious out of focus parts of the image. Even if you have focus peaking, which is where you get the usually red, but a color fringe around the parts of the image that are in focus, even if I'm using that, I'm still going to stop down to a small aperture in order for it to show me just the line of focus in the image instead of showing me that half the image is in focus. So I'm going to do that first. If you can zoom in sorry, I usually have a Nikon on a tripod behind me, so I'm going to point to that, even though it's not there at the moment. My Nikon that I shoot with, I have the center button set so that wherever I put the focus point, it zooms into 100% on live view. And almost all of this I'm going to do in live view. There's no reason to have to bend over and look through the viewfinder, except that you wear your batteries out faster. But that way I can zoom in, really critically focus, then zoom back out. Then I can stop my aperture down to wherever it is that I want to shoot. And you're going to set the aperture for your depth of field. That's one of the final later things on this slide. There are different ways to focus depending on how you're doing this, depending on what kind of techniques or accessories you're using. You might be focusing with the focus ring on the lens. You might be using an entire macro, the rail, a geared rail, or even just a plate like a nodal rail, and sliding the whole thing forward or backward. You might be focusing with the movements of the standards of a bellows. Again, we'll get to all that. If those don't make sense, we'll get to all of those things as we go through here. You might be using some kind of remote app for your camera or a remote device like the Cam Ranger, and there's another one out there that's been on Kickstarter for a while. And I can't think of it at the moment, but you might be using something like that where you can kind of touch a screen on your phone and it'll help focus the camera. Usually, like I said, I'm doing it manually, but it's going to depend on what I'm using, what techniques and accessories are going to determine how I'm focusing the camera. A trick that I learned with view cameras, 4x5 large format cameras, if you're familiar with that kind of thing. You've all seen them in movies. If you're not, the camera where you put the dark cloth over your head and focus, there's a big bellows in between. They're notoriously hard to tell exactly what's in focus. And the way that the way I was taught to do it is you focus past, like you see something come in focus and then go out of focus. And then you come back the other way until the subject is just as out of focus as it was on the other side, if that makes any sense. So you're looking for something that's just starting to go out of focus, come back through focus and going out of focus again, then move the focus, whatever mechanism halfway in between. So if it's a ring on a lens, if I turn it here and it's out of focus, I turn it here and it's out of focus, I'm just going to turn it right back in the middle. And then I know that my subject is in focus. Again, if you have a focus aid on your camera, like focus peaking or anything like that, by all means use it. It will definitely help. Wait before you shoot. This is really true of any kind of thing on a tripod, especially with longer exposures, but it becomes really, really critical when we're dealing with this amount of magnification, number one, longer exposures, number two, and the amount of equipment that we might have set up on top of a tripod. All of those things together are just going to let the camera shake for a couple seconds. So once you get everything else set, everything's ready to shoot, just give it 4 or 5 seconds for the vibrations to dampen out. Again, if you're using live view, you can probably see on the screen the subject moving around because the camera is still shaking. But that's just, it's a good way to help ensure a sharper image. Then the next setting on the exposure triangle, we got our aperture set. The next thing I'm going to think about is ISO. So because I'm doing most of this on a tripod, because I'm doing most of this in controlled circumstances, because most of these techniques I'm shooting things that aren't moving to begin with, I can photograph for whatever time I want. I can shoot for a 30th of a second or 30 seconds or anywhere in between. And it doesn't make any difference to the image except for the exposure time, right? The exposure amount or the length of exposure. So because of that, I can set my ISO as low as possible. And that's just going to help me with cleaner files, more dynamic range, better color saturation, just a better image all the way around. Again, newer cameras are much better at higher ISOs, but there's no reason not to use a lower ISO when you can. The aperture I'm going to set for my depth of field. So generally they're going to be high. You're probably never going to do an advanced macro like a 2:1 or 3:1 life size reproduction at f2.8 or f4 or 5.6. You're probably going to be in the 11, 16, 22 range. If your camera adjusts the aperture number to correspond with the light loss through the lens. We'll come back to that, but our camera, the FP and the FPL do that, and the Nikons do that. They're the only cameras that I'm aware that do. And what it means is if I set my camera at 5.6 at infinity and then turn the focus ring around till I'm at macro, the aperture will actually change from f5.6 to f8 to f11. And it's just showing you the light loss. Like I said, we'll come back to that. But that being said, or all that to say that you might have a higher aperture number available on the settings of the camera than your lens actually says that it is capable of achieving. So you might see an f32 even when your camera says it only goes to 22. And I'll show you some examples of that as we go through here as well. Consider diffraction. Diffraction is quite simply a loss of sharpness due to light rays bending around the blades of an aperture. So the closer the aperture blades are together, you are more likely to have a little loss of sharpness. My answer to that is always the same. Anytime anybody asks me, am I afraid of diffraction? My answer is always the same. I'd rather have a little diffraction and enough depth of field than no diffraction and not enough depth of field. I can tweak sharpness in post. I can't really tweak depth of field in post, not nearly as easily. And then the other answer is try it for yourself. I know a lot of people that have just heard from someone that you should never shoot at f22, and so they never shoot at f22. And they don't know what it's actually going to look like. They don't know on their camera and their lens and that subject and that distance and that magnification what it's actually going to do. So try it. Try it at 22, try it at 16, try it at 11, and then look at them on the screen. See, at 100%, you'll see a difference. But the question is, does it make enough difference, right? Is the loss of sharpness significant enough that you don't want the image anymore? And in all honesty, if you're just putting these on Facebook or Instagram, a little diffraction makes no difference at all. You're printing these 30 by 40 for somebody's living room, okay, it might make a difference. Then the last thing is going to be my exposure, my shutter speed. I'm going to set the shutter speed in order to get the right exposure. Like I said, I don't really care what that number is in particular. Shorter is easier, but if it has to be longer, it has to be longer. But I can set my base exposure from there. I can bracket from there. Theoretically, you could do HDRs from there if you needed to. You can, overexpose and underexpose using shutter speed. But that's going to be the last part of the exposure triangle that I think about. Depth of field, if you've ever done a lot of macro, especially close to the 1-to-1 limitation of most lenses, you realize that the closer you get to a camera, the less depth of field you have. And the less exposure you have. So any lens that is capable of 1-to-1, when you're at 1-to-1, you lose 2 stops of exposure. This is what I was saying about our camera, the FP and the Nikon. It's actually going to show you that loss by changing the aperture number. Canon, I know, doesn't do it. Sony, I don't think, does it. I don't think. I'd have to test that out again. But in any case, you're going to lose 2 stops of exposure. It has to be compensated somehow. Basically, because you're extending the lens farther and farther away from the sensor, if you can envision a cone of light coming through the middle of the lens, it's not exactly how it works, but for theoretical purposes, it's fine. All the light rays cross in the middle and they expand out as a cone. When you're at 1-to-1, that circle of light, or the size of the cone, the diameter, is twice as wide as it was when you were at infinity. If you double a circle, the diameter of a circle, you have 4 times the area of the circle. So the same amount of light is spread out over 4 times the area, and 4 times as a fourth of the light per pixel, or whatever you want to think of in the camera, your exposure is going to decrease by a factor of 2 stops, right? Each stop is a factor of 2, so half is 1 stop, quarter is 2 stops. Your depth of field decreases as well. Essentially, there are formulas for this. I'll show you a few things in just a second, but the closer you get, the less depth of field you're going to have. At 1-to-1, it could be down to a fraction of an inch or a couple millimeters. At 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, it could be even less, or it will be even less than that. So it becomes a challenge to get everything that we want in focus. There are ways to fix it. we'll talk about one of the best as we go through here as well. For depth of field, if I increase my aperture by 2 stops, the number higher 2 stops, I will have twice as much depth of field. It doesn't work every aperture. So from 5.6 to 8, I don't get twice as much depth of field. I get 40% more depth of field. From 5.6 to 11, from 8 to 16, 2 stops, doubling the number basically, I'll get twice as much depth of field because the circle is half as wide. It's all math, it's all physics, but we're not getting into that today. That's another class. I really recommend something on your phone. It's really nice, especially if you're not close to a computer. It's nice to have some sort of source of reference for these kinds of things. I use photo pills. I know Aaron talks about photo pills in his night photography class. It does almost everything you'd ever want to do as an outdoor photographer or a nature photographer. It's fantastic. You want to know what time the sun rises in Cambodia and what direction, it'll tell you exactly that. But for our purposes, it will also tell you with a macro lens at this reproduction ratio and this focus distance, this is how much depth of field I'm going to have, all sorts of things like that. So you can use it to kind of figure out, well, I probably can't shoot at f4. I'm not going to be anywhere close. I need to shoot higher, whatever. There's a lot of nice focus, depth of field, exposure, calculators and tips on there. It'll even talk about diffraction. You can plug in the camera that you use and the focal length and everything else, and it'll tell you how much diffraction you're going to have. Sorry, so that's something you should probably have on your phone anyway. For online reference, I came across a really, really helpful website, and that is extreme-macro.co.uk. And then if you go to the page /calculators, there are more photo calculators than I can imagine anyone would ever want to use. For our purposes, it will tell you all sorts of crazy things for almost all the techniques that we're talking about today as well. So if I'm using a Bellows with this lens, with this extension, with this camera, how much depth of field am I going to get? How much light loss am I going to get? All of those kind of things. It's a really, really useful thing, especially for those of us who get a little bit nerdy about some of the technical information. It was pretty cool to see. I'm going to leave that up for 2 more seconds while you write that down, because that always comes up in the questions at the end of the class is, what was that website you talked about? So extreme-macro.co.uk /calculators.
And Brett, I put that in the chat room for folks too.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
We'll just take a screenshot real quick. There you go. All right, let's talk about some of the techniques then. We're going to start with one of the basics, more simpler kind of thing. That doesn't take a lot of extra equipment or a lot of extra know-how, and that's something called diopters. You may also know the term diopters as close-up filters, macro filters, magnifying filters, magnifier glass, whatever. It is simply a filter. It goes on the front of the lens, has a little bit of a convex curve to it, and it just magnifies the light coming into the lens. It works just like a magnifying glass would that you used to play with when you were a kid. Hey, we were talking about that before class. And it's going to do basically the same thing. It's just enlarging the subject as it comes into the lens. The nice thing is, like a filter, it will fit on multiple lenses. So this isn't something that you're just going to use with one particular lens, or can only use with one particular lens. That being said, though, they're probably not adaptable to other lenses. Maybe you could put it on a smaller filter thread with an adapter, but you're probably not going to go higher to wider lenses or lenses with wider filter threads. There are all types. There are some that are dedicated, specifically designed for a lens. We make a lens for Canon and Nikon DSLRs. That is the 18-300 contemporary. Sorry, DC contemporary. And out of the box, that lens is capable of right around a third life size. So we'd say 1 to 3, I think it's 1 to 2.9, but whatever it is, 1 to 3 reproduction. And with the diopter that we make for that lens, that was specifically designed for that lens, it takes that lens to 1 to 2, so half life size. So you're getting basically 50% more 33% more, however you want to look at that, more magnification out of the lens just by putting that filter on the front. That's pretty common, that you'll get about 33 or 50% more magnification with a diopter. They come in different strengths, all the way from like a quarter or a third, all the way up to 10. That's the strongest one I've ever seen. It's pretty rare, pretty uncommon, pretty expensive to find 10x diopters. It's something you'd have to search for. And I don't think I'd really recommend them at that point. There's a few problems with diopters. First, it's going to reduce your close focus distance, which means the distance from or if you want to think about it as working distance, that's usually the way my brain works. The distance from the front element of the lens to the subject when I'm in focus or at maximum focus, sorry, minimum focus, maximum reproduction. It's going to shorten that distance. The 18-300 that we make is already about 3 inches working distance without the filter. So with the filter, it gets even closer. You're down to like 2 inches away from the subject. And that can be a challenge. If you get too close to your subject with your lens, you start casting shadows. It's hard to light the subject. Even can be a challenge to focus because one tiny little change makes a huge change in the image. You're also going to lose infinity focus in the lens generally, but you can just unscrew the filter and shoot without it and get your infinity focus back. So it's not like you're modifying the lens in any way. And here's the reason that I don't like or don't recommend the really, really strong ones. There's probably a better way to get to a lot of magnification. There are good diopters. There are not so good diopters. There are good pairs. A magnifying filter that works really well with a particular lens. There are some that are just kind of generic and are pretty average with any kind of lens. So it's something that you could try out if you have one, if you have access to one or can find one that's relatively affordable. You can get more macro capabilities out of an ordinary lens and maybe not have to look at more dedicated equipment. But there can be some sharpness, some loss of sharpness, some chromatic aberration. There can be problems. Anytime that you add an extra piece of glass into the optical formula that the lens designer didn't account for in the first place, you have the chance of losing image quality or introducing some sort of aberrations. Okay, a few examples. So the AML72-01 is our fancy name for the diopter that we make for the 18-300. I didn't have an 18-300 with me, but I did have an 18-35 that has the same filter thread. So I decided to put it on there and shoot with it instead. It's about 50% more magnification than the lens would be able to achieve otherwise. That's definitely not like life-size reproduction, but it's bigger, a lot bigger than I would have been able to get without it. And to me, the details there, that file looks really clean, really sharp. So then this is a shot that I did previously with the 18-300. This is just straight, 1/3 life-size reproduction without the filter on it, and then adding that filter in, getting a little bit closer, and I get 1:2, half life-size reproduction, and then just kind of recompose the image, change the background around, and shot it again, something a little bit more pleasing with that filter on the 18-300 as well. Okay. The next technique, the next tool that we'll talk about here for advanced macro are teleconverters. And this may not be something that's ever occurred to you for macro photography. It didn't to me initially either. And I kind of came across it on some blogs, on some websites. And then Sigma actually recommended it when we came out with some of our teleconverters. And they mentioned that they worked well with macro lenses, and a light bulb went off in my head. Well, that actually does make sense. A teleconverter fits between the lens and the camera. If you want to think about it, it just goes on the back of the lens. And then you put that on the camera, and it just magnifies the light coming through the lens. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference if I'm shooting an animal 100 yards away, or a football player at the other end of the field, or a flower 6 inches away. It's still going to magnify the image the same way. There are actually some really nice advantages to using teleconverters for macro photography. They come in, generally speaking, they come in 1.4 and 2x factors, if you will. And that is the amount that they magnify the image, either 40% or 100%. So you end up with an image that's 140% of life size, or of what would have been capable without the teleconverter, or double 200% of what it was without the teleconverters. The reason for that is, again, as far as exposure goes, a change in each f-stop is a factor of 1.4. Rounded off, it's the square root of 2. But if I go from 2.8 to 4 to 5.6 to 8 to 11, those are each increases in number or decreases in exposure by a factor of the square root of 2. And that's why teleconverters exist as 1.4 and not 1.25 or 1.5 or a number that might make more sense to us. You can use either one. You're going to get that much magnification. You're also going to lose light, though, because you're magnifying the image. You're spreading the light out again, just like the macro lens does to begin with. So you're going to lose some light, and the 1.4 loses 1 stop of light. The 2x is going to lose 2 stops of light, or 2 stops of exposure. So you're going to have to compensate for that in the image as well. The nice thing about them is there's no loss of infinity focus. I could still use these to photograph something a long distance away. There's also no reduction in minimum focus. So I can put this on the lens. I can focus without it. I can just take the lens off and put the teleconverter on, put it back on, and I get more magnification from the same distance away. Where most of these techniques, in order to get more magnification, I have to get closer to the subject. So that's actually a big benefit. That means I can get more magnification, even double life size, from a farther distance away. So especially with a shorter macro lens, that's going to work really nicely. Like anything, adding glass into an optical formula, there could be some loss of sharpness. I see really next to none with the 1.4x. I do see a little bit with the 2x, and that's pretty common. That's pretty standard in teleconverters. I would say the same is true with using a long lens and a teleconverter. I don't see much difference at all with 1.4s with a good lens and a good matched teleconverter, but I do see a little bit when I put 2x converters on. So this is our 105, our shot with the 105 DGDN. This is the new macro art lens, the second art lens. I'm looking for it on the table, but I don't have it with me. It was packed for a trip that I just got back from. So, but that's the straight lens without any teleconverter on it. So that's 100% life size. And the way I do that, if you're not aware, just flip the switch on the side of the lens. If you have it on the camera, that's fine too. Flip the switch to manual focus. Like I said, I'm going to do most of this anyway. Most of the time, your cameras are going to hunt a lot when you're doing extreme macro. It just doesn't get enough contrast or shapes or whatever for it to focus on. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But flip it around to manual and then turn the focus ring until you are at minimum focus. Then move the whole camera. If it's sliding the tripod, the rail, whatever it is, move the whole camera closer to the subject until the subject's in focus, and that will show you what maximum reproduction is. So I know the lens is capable of 1:1, and at its closest focus, it's going to give me 1:1. What I want you to see here, though, is this is f/22. I chose that in order to get everything in focus all the way through those coffee beans, top to bottom. And then as I change here, so I put the 1.4 converter on the back of the lens, put it back on the camera, and then again, move the camera forward or backward until the subject was in focus. So I know I'm still at minimum focus distance. I'm still at maximum reproduction. So I know I'm at 40% more than life size, or 1.4 times life size. And my aperture, I didn't change anything. The number is still the same on the lens. The setting is still the same on the lens. The aperture blades haven't moved, but the effective aperture goes down 1 stop from 22 to 32, even though the lens is, I don't think is supposed to be able to go to 20 to 32. The camera tells me it's 32 to show me that stop of light loss, okay? Then I move to the 2x converter, and again, the aperture now goes to 45. Same thing, put the converter on the back of the lens, move the whole camera forward or backward until it's in focus. So now I know I'm at twice life size reproduction. and my aperture goes up to 45. And obviously the shutter speeds have to increase in order to compensate for that as well. So I go from life size to 40% more to 100% more. Okay, and that's kind of the setup. This is without a teleconverter on it. That's the 105 macro. That's the FP, actually, the one that you're looking at me through, but looks just like this little camera down here, the FPL, with a cable release on it. You can see a macro rail underneath that. I don't know how clear that is in the image, but it's kind of like a long lens plate with two dovetails, one on top and one on the bottom. So the tripod head can clamp on the bottom side, and the top part can clamp onto the camera, or the camera can clamp onto that, whatever. Then I got smart enough and turned the back light off, which is this thing you're looking at here, but this is with the 2x converter in between. So just take the lens off, put the converter on, and put it right back on the front of the camera, and then adjust the whole camera, slide it up and down. One of the things I love about our FPL with this macro lens is it's still, I might get this wrong, but it's probably under 2.5 pounds. It's going to be right in that ballpark. So it's a very, very manageable macro package, macro kit that doesn't weigh nearly as much as my older Nikon gear with bigger macro lenses and everything else. So for this kind of thing, it's much easier to adjust. And you can also see here, there's two of these little LEDs on different tabletop tripods, just to bring some light in from both sides. So it's a nice cross light, helps to eliminate glare and reflections and that kind of thing, lighting something from both sides, and make the light more even, so I don't have a dark spot and bright highlights. And so this is, again, 1-to-1 reproduction with the 105 DGDN art lens at f11. I could shoot a little bit lower. I probably could have done this at 5, 6, or 8 if I needed to, because the surface of the subject is flat. So as long as my camera is parallel to the subject, I really don't need very much depth of field in order to get everything in focus. But f11 at just under a second was easy enough, so I don't think I bothered going down from there. Again, with the 1.4 converter, goes up to f16, goes off one stop, and then the shutter speed goes up a full stop, doubles as well. And then with the 2x converter, twice life size, another stop to f22, and another stop to 3.2 seconds. So I did spin it around in between, so it's not a perfect light. Like the coffee beans were. All right, next technique. These are extension tubes, kind of similar to a teleconverter in that they usually fit between, or they do fit between the camera lens and the camera body. They are exactly what they say they are. They are a tube, a hollow tube that extends the lens from the camera. If you've heard me do the intro to macro class, I kind of touch on extension tubes quickly, and we touch on the fact that macro lenses do what they do, or achieve the focus they achieve, by extending farther from the sensor than an ordinary lens would be able to do. So if I could take an ordinary lens and extend it farther away, I get some macro capabilities. If I take a macro lens and extend it even farther, I get even more macro than the lens was designed for originally, or was capable of originally. They generally come in sets of 3. There's usually a thin one, a medium one, and a thick one. They're available for literally any camera mount you can imagine. Even some esoteric film camera from 50 years ago, I guarantee you someone still makes extension tubes for them. They don't make any other accessories in the world for other cameras like this, but you can find an extension tube for anything. And any modern camera. If the manufacturer doesn't make them, someone else does. And again, go talk to the nice folks at Glazers, and I know they'll help you find the extension tubes that you need. The amount of magnification increase is going to depend on 2 things. One is how many of those tubes you use, how far you're spacing the lens from the camera, and what lens you start with. So think about it in terms of a ratio. If I take a 50, 60, 70 millimeter lens and extend it another 50 millimeters, I'm going to get double what it was capable of to begin with. But if I take a longer lens, like one of our older macro lenses, like the 150 or the 180, and extend it 50 millimeters, I'm not going to get as much increase, because I'm not changing the focal length or the focal distance by as big a factor or as big a percentage. So you'll get more magnification out of the really short ones. Your problem, though, is going to be working distance. And that is, as I move closer, like a lot of these techniques, as I move the lens farther away, I have to focus closer. As I focus closer, I could end up getting really, really right on top of something where I can't light it. I can't even focus on it. So I don't recommend this for the really short macro lenses. If you have the 40 millimeters for full frame cameras, even there's some even shorter than that, that sometimes you find wide angle ones, you're probably not going to have great results using a set of extension tubes with those really wide angle or short macro lenses. You probably want to start in the 60, 70 millimeter range. And even the 90 to 105 range is going to be very appropriate for this, because you'll still get a good increase in magnification, but you won't be right on top of something. Because they're hollow, you're not introducing any extra glass into the optical formula. So you're really not going to lose quality because of that. You're just looking through less of the lens, if you think about it that way. As I magnify, stretch the lens out, I'm just looking through a narrower and narrower part of the lens through the front. So you could be losing some sharpness just because the lens isn't capable of keeping up, but it's not going to be significant. This is with one of our older lenses, the 70EX. There's a reason for that, and that is that lens still had an aperture ring on it, so it's nice and easy to control. It'll pop up here again in just a second. But that's just the lens straight, and then with a full set of extension tubes in between the lens and the camera. And as best as I can tell, that's right about 2.5 times life size. There is a thing in the box that comes with them when you buy a set that tells you, with this lens, with this one ring or 2 rings or all 3 rings, this is how much you're going to get, how much more magnification you're going to get out of it. I couldn't even begin to tell you where that is anymore. So it's just kind of a guess that that's about 2.5 times life size. And there you can see the setup. So this is actually our 150 millimeter macro lens, an older standby. This is probably the lens that I use the most on a Nikon camera. Again, you can see this is just a long lens plate underneath, but I'm using that as a rail. It's clamped here. I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, but it's clamped here on the tripod head, holding the long lens plate, and then the lens itself is mounted to the other side of the plate. And then there's a full set, number 1, number 2, number 3, extension tubes in between the lens and the camera. And that's a piece of bark, and maybe hard to see on your screen, but that's a piece of bark. I'll give you a better picture of that in a second. And then for this one, I wanted some definition. One trick about light, I'll throw this in. Any kind of lighting, 99% of what we do in photography, when we light something with artificial lights, or we try to modify natural light, heck, even when we photograph just in natural light, we're trying to mimic afternoon, earlier morning, and later afternoon sunlight. Okay, so think about what that looks like. The sun's not straight overhead, it's not straight off to the side, it's at an angle. Angles are pleasing, they give us shadows, but softer shadows. Direct light from the side or direct light from overhead tends to give us harsh shadows. It's warmer color. So warmer colors just tend to be pleasing for almost anything. People look better in warm light than cold light. Flowers look better in warm light than cold light. Landscapes look better in warm light than cold light. So that's a good technique. But the other nice thing is, instead of using one light, by using one light instead of 2, I'm increasing the amount of, or I'm showing off the texture and detail in a subject. So let's move on. So I have some shadow, and the shadow helps to define the textures, the details, the surface, the shape of the subject. If I illuminated this from both sides, it would be very flat. And that's just a conscious decision. That's just a creative choice, but that's something to consider with light. If I have light coming from both sides, I'll have very soft light with very little shadow and very little definition. If I bring light in directly from one side, I'll have very harsh light with very pronounced shadows and a lot of definition. And you obviously can go things somewhere in between as well. Piece of toast. I was in my kitchen working on this, trying to figure out what in the world to photograph for some of these things, but it was easy enough with that rig just to swap out the subjects underneath and find something else to put in front. Went outside, found this leaf. It's not very big, 2 or 3 inches across, but the surface of it looked like an old leather chair or something to me. So it was really pretty. And again, this is 2 lights, but I was playing around with both of the lights, trying to make sure that I got some kind of even light, but just enough of a cross light to show off some of the textures in the veins of the leaf as well, and not have bright spots of glare. Sometimes that's a problem as well. Okay. Next thing is going to be bellows. And a bellows unit or bellows, macro bellows, works almost exactly like an extension tube in that it just faces the lens away from the camera. The difference is it's variable. So I can move the front end, I can move the back end, I can stretch them farther apart, I can move them closer together. So it's like having an extension tube or a set of extension tubes, but they're basically infinitely variable. I've even seen some stuff done with multiple sets of bellows, stacked one on another. We'll come back to combining things later. Generally speaking, they're going to work with those normal to long lenses, just like extension tubes work well. So the really wide angle lenses, you just end up right on top of something. For instance, that Oreo shot, I actually tried with a 50 millimeter macro lens first, and I was focused about 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch from the front surface of the lens. If you had something really, really wide and really stretched out with the bellows, you could actually bring the focal plane inside the lens, which is impossible to achieve. So you wouldn't be able to focus on anything at that point. So the longer stuff like the 70 macro that we make for Canon, Sony, and L mount, that would be a really great choice for this type of thing. The 105 would work really nicely. One of the downsides, most macro bellows have no electronics. So there's no communication between the lens and the camera. This is one of the reasons that a lot of people do use older lenses for these, especially older Nikon mount lenses, because they have aperture rings on them that are mechanically coupled. You can turn the ring and they actually move the aperture. There are bellows that have electronics that go in between the two, but in general, you're not going to find them that way. So you want to be able to control the lens somehow. And so this is why I said I'll come back to why I use the older 70 macro that we made. And that this is one of the times that I use it, because I can control the aperture without it being coupled to the camera. Magnification, generally we control magnification from the back standard. So the closer it is, the more magnification I have, the farther away, the less. And then I'm going to use the front standard, moving it forward or backward to get everything in focus, or I'm going to slide the whole thing forward and backward in order to get things in focus. With bellows, it's really kind of a play of all the parts involved. It's where the lens is positioned, where the sensor is positioned, the distance between the two of those, and where the distance between the lens and the subject. Hopefully one of these images, you'll get an idea of that in just a second as well. So just toothpicks, but definitely more than life size, probably 2.5 times life size, maybe even more than that. And this is one of the things I love about macro photography, is just being able to see details that you'd never be able to see with the human eye. I always mean to have this thing. It sits over on my kitchen counter. I don't really even know why, but that nut is maybe an inch tall, maybe. And the frame's 1.5 inches, and that's not even the whole nut. So I know that's at least twice life size. And again, there's more texture in that rust than you could really ever make out with your eye. So that's the older 70 macro lens. And it's got a focus ring on it, aperture. The bellows unit here in between, and then the camera's just mounted on the back. So there's a gear. There's a gear here on the top end of the bellows rail underneath it that moves the back standard forward and backward, or moves the camera forward and backward, or up and down from this position. And then there's one on the front standard as well that moves that front standard up and down, or closer and farther from the subject. And then there's a bracket underneath here that just mounts to the tripod. And that's just a clamp. I don't think that's geared, but I can unlock it and I can move the whole thing on that bottom rail as well. So there's a lot of different ways to set this up and a lot of different ways to tweak the position of a bellows system. And this is kind of a spoiler, but this is what you're going to look at next. Those are little currency bills from China. They're not even near the size of a dollar bill. That the one that's under the camera now might be like 2 inches by 4 inches, and the other one is even smaller than that. And you can see what that is capable of. So that's, I don't know, 3 or 4 times life size easily. And there's still just an unbelievable amount of detail. You can see every fiber in the paper. And if anybody knows what that says, let me know. The next thing then we're going to talk about is called reversing rings. A reversing ring is something that goes between the camera and the lens, but allows us to reverse the lens, to put the lens on backward on the front of the camera. And the first time somebody told me this, about this concept, this technique, it seemed like heresy. It just seemed like an awful idea to turn a lens around and mount it on the front of a camera. And in some ways it is. There are a lot of problems. This is one of the more difficult things that we're talking about today. Backing up, a reversing ring just screws on the front of a lens just like a filter would, but it's just a ring. Looks kind of like an adapter ring. So it screws on the filter thread on the front of a lens. The other side of the filter, though, the threads go on the lens. The other side is a camera mount, or the back end of a lens, basically, if you think about it that way. So then it fits on your camera and locks in place. So you have a lens turned around backward facing the camera. And the idea is this, that there really is no lens. Let's go with theoretical here. A normal lens, so a 50 millimeter or so on a full frame camera, the rays of light that come in, cross, and they go back out at basically the same angle. It's not true in reality, but let's just picture it that way. Longer lenses, the angle of view goes down, so the rays of light coming into the lens are much more narrow, but when they come out of the back, they get spread out. A wide angle lens is exactly the opposite. They come in at a wide angle, but then they're going to get focused more onto the sensor. So they come in at a wide angle and they go down like that. So if you take a wide angle lens and turn it around, it sees a narrow angle, but projects it out or magnifies it onto the sensor. In theory, that's perfect for macro photography. And that's the idea. So generally speaking, you're dealing with lenses wider than normal. In theory, you could use anything. I find somewhere in the 20 to 28 millimeter range, maybe a 35 is going to be the most effective. 20, 21, 24, 28 will work really well for that kind of thing. The shorter the lens, the shorter the magnification, or the shorter the focal length of the lens normally, then the more magnification you're going to get out of it when you reverse it around. Generally speaking on this as well, you have no electronic controls. This is where I'm going to give you an example of do as I say and not as I do. I'm going to show you how I made something work, but I really don't recommend it for too many people. There are better ways to try it. But you have no electronics. Most lenses today, just for instance, this is our 35 1.4 DGD and the new 35 for Sony and L-mount mirrorless. It does not focus. If I move the focus ring when the camera's not on, nothing moves in the lens. It's not mechanically coupled. There's an aperture in here, but I'm not even so sure that aperture moves the aperture blades in the lens if there's no power to the lens. So when I reverse it and put it on the front of a camera, I can't control any of those things without some inconvenience. Again, I'll get back to that part in a second. Manual lenses tend to work well. There are some little gadgets that'll attach to the back of the lens that you can use to change the aperture on a Nikon lens that just had the lever on it, something like that, even if it doesn't have a physical aperture ring. There's another way to do it, which is lock the aperture in the position you want by removing it from a camera while the camera's turned on. Like I said, I'll get back to that one. You're going to focus by moving the entire camera. The focus ring on the lens is not going to make much difference at this point because it's not changing what it sees. It just doesn't move enough since it's been reversed. So you're going to just slide the whole camera forward and backward. You can use the aperture to control depth of field, and that's about all of the controls that you have over it. There's definitely possibility of an image quality loss. There's definitely a possibility of chromatic aberrations or other aberrations. And it's not to knock any particular lens. The lens designers that designed these great lenses very carefully thought about every single ray of light coming from the subject through the lens to the sensor when the lens is mounted in this direction. They never took into consideration what would happen when you shined light in the other way. So it doesn't necessarily all go the way it's supposed to go to the right places. And I'll show you an example of that as well. Again, nothing against the lens designers, but so I had to do this with well, that's a 24 millimeter lens. That's our current art lens on the front of a Nikon camera. If you're familiar with our products, you'll notice that's a Sony mount lens, which means I have no aperture control. I have no focus control. Actually, there is focus control. That one is mechanically coupled, I believe. So I could change the focus, but it doesn't help much anyway. So in order to change the aperture, first I had to put a Sony camera on the bottom of this setup, the back end of the lens, if you will, the part farthest from the camera, from the Nikon camera. I had to mount a Sony camera to that, change the aperture to wide open, take the camera off without turning the camera off so it would leave the aperture in place. Focus, put the Sony back on the back end of the lens, set the aperture to wherever it was that I shot this, and take the camera off again and take a picture. And I had to go back and forth with that, setting up different things here. Not convenient, like I said, and not really recommended. It's not a great idea to remove a lens from a camera without turning the camera off. Not good for the camera, not good for the lens. But it worked. So that's the kitchen towel that you saw in the last shot. And you can see there's way more detail with that than you'd ever be able to achieve with a standard macro lens. Not saying that you can get more this way than you could with some of the other techniques that we've talked about. But if you already have a wide angle lens around and you don't have a macros bellows, you can find reversing rings pretty easily, and they're not that expensive. So you might be able to get greater than life-size reproduction without investing a lot in some crazy equipment. That's just the countertop, piece of marble, cutting board. So I believe that's walnut over here and maple, and you can see the individual pores in the wood and the grain, all that. And these are just watch parts. You can buy these on Amazon. You buy bags for nothing. I mean, for a few dollars, you can buy a bag of watch parts. If you want the really fancy ones with the faces and everything, you have to pay a little bit more. But anyway, you can just buy these things on Amazon. You can buy old shells, fossils, all sorts of stuff like that, that make great subjects for this type of thing. So these are tiny little things. This is a huge amount of reproduction, and it's nice and sharp. There's a lot of detail in the surface of some of these gears. But if you notice this gear over on the left, it's got a halo all the way around it, most of the way around it. That is color fringing, which is chromatic aberration. So even though this is, when put on forward, is one of the best wide angle lenses on the market, put on backward, it ends up with some chromatic aberration. And again, it's not the fault of the lens or the designer or anything else. It's just something that you're likely to encounter when you turn lenses around. Okay. Then this is not so much an equipment thing or technique or way of doing things as it is just a technique for increasing our depth of field. There's also some other benefits to this as well. We talked about it at the beginning. There's really only 3 things that you can do in macro photography in order to increase depth of field. The first is turn your aperture higher. The higher that aperture number, the more depth of field you have. Okay, there is a limit. Lenses only go so high, and you might have diffraction at the high end. The second is you can back up. The farther you are from the subject, the more depth of field you have. That's counterintuitive for advanced macro. We got in close because we wanted the magnification in the first place. We don't want to back up and lose that. So sometimes we have to resort to number 3, and that is focus stacking. Focus stacking is just taking a series of images, generally with less depth of field than a single image would have, and allowing the computer to put it back together. to combine or recombine the in-focus elements of multiple images. There are cameras that do it. I know that there are some Olympus cameras that will photograph and combine focus stacking internally. The Nikon that I shoot with will automate the capture process, but will not combine the images internally. So there's different variables or different variants. 5 or 10 years ago, if you wanted to try this, you had to do it all manually. You had to set it up manually, you had to combine it manually. So it's a lot easier and more approachable now, but it still can be a little bit tricky. You can generally get away with less depth of field and less exposure, less time, less shutter speed for the single exposures than one long exposure was in the first place. So it makes the capturing simpler, especially if something's on a tripod, subject's on a table and not moving. It's relatively easy now to automate the capture for that. The general technique, I'm looking at something and trying to see the closest part of the subject to the camera that I want to be in focus. And those are all really important parts. I can't start in the middle and come forward and then go backward. I need to start at the front, the closest point to the camera. There might be something in the subject that I don't want in focus or don't care if it's in focus. That's fine, you can ignore that. So for a flower, it's usually the stamen and the pistils right in the middle of the flower that's pointing toward the camera. I'm going to look for the closest part of that I want in focus and focus on that. Again, live view, 100%, zoom in, manually focus until that's just perfectly crisp, sharp. And then I'm going to capture that at a lower aperture, probably 5, 6, or 8. Something like that, and then overlap your focus, overlap your depth of field. 50% is a safe bet, 33% is usually okay. What you don't want to do is have your focus here and then here and then here. You're going to end up with bands that are a little sharper and a little softer and sharper and softer when it recombines, when the software recombines all those images. So you want to make sure that you're overlapping what's in focus. And you can tell, you can look at an image and kind of see. Take one, zoom in, you can see the part that's in focus, and then look in your subject, again, zoom in on your camera and refocus slightly in. Used to be, especially with DSLRs, it was very, very difficult to do this with the focus ring on the lens. It's possible, but it was kind of a challenge. Because the most DSLR lenses, the ring is mechanically coupled to the elements, meaning that when I turn the ring, there's a physical connection between that and the elements of glass moving in the lens. So that it's a linear movement. I move a little bit, it moves a little bit, I move a lot, it moves a lot. With a lot of mirrorless lenses, it's what we call focus by wire. It's an electronic connection so that a little bit of change at the long end, if I'm shooting a landscape, I make a little change, it makes a little change, or it might make more change. But when I get to the macro level, I can set the sensitivity, or the manufacturer's already set the sensitivity. So a bigger movement moves the focus less. And it allows me to more precisely position the focus and more precisely change the focus in between multiple images. So my Nikon, before I had the D850 that could do this, the capturing internally, I used a product called Cam Ranger, and the Cam Ranger would automate the process of capture for me. I could tell it what I wanted to be in focus first, how many pictures I wanted to take, and how big or little I wanted to change in between each frame, and it would shoot all the frames for me, and it would refocus the lens. Again, the D850 does that internally. I can just tell it to start through the menu, and it will take all the images for me, put them in a folder, then I go back to the computer and put them together. With the newer stuff like our 70 and our 105 on Sony or on our L mount, the FP and the FPL, I can do this with the focus ring on the lens. It's really that easy and that precise now. And I'll show you some examples that were done both ways. You're going to change focus. There are multiple options. So like I said, you might do it with a focus ring. You can use a macro rail, especially a geared rail, and you can just make really small adjustments on the rail. You're not moving the focus element in the lens, but you're moving the whole camera and lens closer to the subject. And that's going to increase the magnification or move the focus through the subject slightly as you go through. Probably want to leave a little bit of room, maybe 10 or 20% around the subject, because when you combine the images, you'll probably have to crop the final picture as well. Photoshop and Lightroom, you probably already have access to that, and they will combine these images together for you. They already have this built in. It's under photo merge, just like HDR or panoramics or anything else that would combine multiple images. You're just going to combine focus of an element instead of exposure portions of an element or whatever it is. I don't find that it does a great job. Try it. If it works for you, by all means use it because you've already got it. I use a product called Zerene Stacker, and that's the last one there, Zerene. I find it the most intuitive, and it's never let me down, and it's really simple to use. You just drop everything in and it combines the images. It works as a plugin for Lightroom now too, so I don't even have to leave Lightroom to do it. A lot of people swear by Helicon Focus. They're kind of the two prevalent platforms for this type of thing. So single image, again, Nikon that did not do focus stacking internally. So I had to move a focus rail, slowly move it, or sorry, this was with the Cam Ranger. So I told it to start on the beginning, and the Cam Ranger refocused the lens and took multiple images. I tried my best at f32, the highest I could go on the lens, to get everything in focus in a single exposure. And even at 15 seconds at f32, I'm not quite there. The very, very back of the petals is just slightly soft, and the very, very front part of this part of the flower, whatever you want to call it, is slightly soft as well. Everything else on the inside is fine. Might be a little bit of diffraction because it's 32. So in order to get everything in focus, what I did is change to 5.6, 0.6, 2/3 of a second for each frame, and start on the very, very closest part, and then refocus, or the Cam Ranger automatically refocus. Like I said, however you do it, there's multiple ways, but it's going to refocus throughout the image until the back is in focus. And if you're using something that automates, like a Cam Ranger, like the Nikon that I have, some other cameras that do it, if you tell it to shoot 20 frames and you didn't get all the way there, just tell it to shoot another 10. It'll start from where it was and keep going. So you don't have to start the whole process over again. And then I take all those images into Zerene Stacker, and it puts them all together, and everything's in focus. One of the nice things about focus stacking, or one of the I don't know, side benefits, I guess, of this, the whole subject's in focus now in a single frame, or in 30 frames, but stacked together into one flat image. But because I shot each one at 5.6, the background is much, much softer than it would be when it was in a single frame or a single exposure. So if you notice that stem at the bottom, it's a lot softer, and that's all the background you can really see, but it's a lot softer than it would be if I shot this or tried to shoot this in one single frame with a really big depth of field. So that can be a benefit. If you find a subject that you can't isolate from the background in a single exposure, try focus stacking, because you can shoot it with smaller slices of depth of field and probably be able to put it back together with less of the background showing. So this is the new 105 DG DN Art. It's on this camera here, the Sony A7R III. And this is focus stacked by manually changing the focus. I just move the focus ring on the lens. And 13 times, I'd zoomed in on the LCD screen on the back until the very, very points of the closest hairs of the fly were in focus. I use focus peaking, so I could tell that there's a red outline around the hairs closest to me, and then I just moved the focus a little bit between each frame. And with a cable release in one hand, move the lens, wait a second or two, fire, move the lens, wait a second or two, fire. Same here, this is 21 frames, but there's no way in the world that, I tried it, you can't get anywhere close to this with all those hairs coming toward the camera, away from the camera. You can't possibly get all of that in focus in a single frame. There's no way to get that composition all in focus without focus stacking. Some other food for thought, I guess, other things you could consider here. You can combine a lot of these techniques. I mentioned a little bit before But you could put some extension tubes on between the lens and the bellows, or maybe the bellows and the camera. You could put a diopter on the front of your lens you're using bellows. You could put teleconverters on the back of extension tubes. You do run into problems sometimes with vignetting, like parts of the things that you're using start to block some of the light. But other than that, if they fit, they'll probably work. They'll probably give you more magnification. You can combine focus stacking with a bellows. You can just use the bellows itself to change the focus of the image and capture things that way. I mentioned the Cam Ranger before. It just automates the process for focus stacking if you don't have a camera that does it already. Helicon has a newer product called the FB Tube. Fits between a lens and a camera and plugs into the camera or plugs into your phone. I don't have one. I've just seen these things, and I have friends who do, and they swear by them. But it will automate the process as well. It refocuses the lens for you. For the capture or for the automation of capturing focus stacking. The extreme end of this is something from a company called Cognisys, a product called the Stack Shot. And the Stack Shot, it's like a cradle. You put the whole camera down on it, plug the thing in, put the subject on it as well, and it will refocus the camera, move the camera, take pictures, everything. If you want to see how the extreme end of this is done, look at Zurine's website, even if you're not going to download their software. But Zurine Stacker has a really good page on how those crazy pictures of a bug's eye are done. And they're done with products like the Stack Shot, and they're 300 different images, all, a 100th of a millimeter apart. It's bizarre. There's no way in the world you could do it by hand. And you're going to leave your computer running for hours to put things back together. And it's just crazy. But that's the extreme end of that. There's another thing called a lens coupler. Sometimes you can put a macro lens on the front of a regular lens. You can put enlarging lens or a microscope lens even on the front of a regular lens. You can reverse a wide angle lens on the front of a macro lens. And there are couplers that basically hold the lenses together in between for that type of thing. You can use enlarging lenses and microscope lenses just by themselves, and there are companies that make adapters to mount older lenses like that onto cameras, or again, you can use them on the front of other lenses. I'll leave you with a couple thoughts here, more things to consider, but macro is tough. We're magnifying the image. Extreme macro or advanced macro like this, we're magnifying the image even more. But we're also magnifying everything else. We're magnifying the shake of a camera. Like I said, some of those setups with the bellows hanging off the front of the tripod, I had to wait 4 or 5 seconds in order for everything to stabilize and dampen the vibrations before I could even fire. I had to make sure that I wasn't taking a step. I realized that if I just took a step in my kitchen, it shook the tripod enough that it soften the image. Like I said, you might never notice that type of thing if you were just taking a portrait or a landscape, but for this level of macro, it really does make a difference. Any motion in the subject, whether it's caused by the subject or caused by the environment, the imperfections in the optical system are going to become even more prevalent or more obvious. Macro photography really is challenging. It's something that it's a lot of fun. It's something that you can do really anywhere, everywhere. I almost always, anywhere I go, any kind of travel, I almost always have a macro lens with me just because I never know what I'm going to find. But extreme macro is even more challenging. Be patient. Don't get frustrated with yourself. Don't get frustrated with the equipment. Take your time. Learn from what you've done well. Learn from your mistakes, try to figure it out. Ask me, ask other people, look at images online, sign up for some Facebook groups, find camera clubs, find some mentors, and again, learn from other people who have already figured this stuff out. I have, One of my favorite phrases from Britain was on one of their coins when I lived over there, is standing on the shoulders of giants. We all got where we are in photography because somebody else helped us out. So don't be ashamed to ask for help, and don't get frustrated and give up just because you couldn't figure it out. Somebody else can help you get there, I promise. I think that's it. That's it. So I'm sure that Aaron has
He's been busy.
Most of your questions.
Yes, he's answered a ton of questions in the chat. We have a couple that we'll ask and then we'll wrap it up because we are a little bit over time. So let's talk about Bellows. Let's take a step back and talk about Bellows a little bit. We had a couple of questions around mounting the Bellows to the newer DSLRs where the grip is more pronounced. So any tips or tricks to get that to work, or any suggestions around that?
Yeah, I thought about mentioning it and I've skipped over it. If you notice the picture of the Bellows that I showed you, that was my D850 that in every other picture had a grip on it. The reason I took the grip off of it is it will not go on that Bellows because it was made for an old film camera.
Okay, but what about the hand grip itself? Have you had any issues with that?
Well, so there is a trick. Use one of the extension tubes. Just use the thinnest extension tube usually. It will space the camera out just far enough from the Bellows that you could twist the camera on that way. Okay,
cool. And then I know that you talked about LED panels, and we've shared some options for folks in the chat because you said that panel isn't particularly available anymore, but there are newer options and from other brands like Aperture or photodiox, like Aaron mentioned, Nanlite. There's lots of options. So I also shared an article that I wrote on our blog about those as well. So other options. So do you have a recommendation, or could you just talk about maybe ring lights that fit on the front of the lens, or speed lights? Do you ever use either of those options in these situations, or do you kind of stick with the LEDs?
I generally stick with LEDs. The LED rings I find okay, especially for this kind of thing. The problem with flash has always been the problem with flash is that you can't see what's going to happen. It's just another step. It's fine. I can control flashes well enough. The problem that I find for macro though is most flashes, most speed lights are way too powerful.
Okay.
Even turned all the way down, they have way too much light. And they tend to be a very, very small little flash tube, no matter what kind of diffusion you put on the front of it. It's a very point light source, which means you get very harsh shadows. That's one of the reasons I like these LED panels, because they're 5 inches wide and 3 inches tall, whatever that is, but it's something like that. So it's an appropriate size that gives me a softer light for smaller subjects. You can do it with macro, and there are macro lights. Godox actually just announced a new ring system with little macro flashes that I'm really intrigued by.
Okay.
Nikon and Canon made systems that are $1,000, and Godox's system is going to be a whole lot less expensive.
Right.
So that might be a viable option.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I think that was super helpful. Lots of great comments and thank yous coming in from people who have been watching. I know that we could probably spend an entire day or weekend on this topic, but unfortunately we don't have that time today. So what I'd like to do is thank Aaron for all of your energy and comments and question answering about specific lens questions. And then Brett, of course, thank you for your time and that presentation. I know that people found it very informative and helpful. And to everyone tuning in today, thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, this will be up for a little while so you can watch it. And if you have additional questions, feel free to put those in the comments or reach out to Brett through his Instagram, as he mentioned early on. We can spam you, Brett.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you also to Sigma for helping to facilitate and make this happen. And I'll just, as we close out, I'll just say check our website for other upcoming events in person and online. Thank you all and have a great rest of the week.